Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. On behalf of members of the committee, I'd like to thank Dr. Arha, and I thank him in particular for taking part in our proceedings despite the time difference, which makes things particularly uncomfortable for him. And I would like to remind you that the Atlantic Council, established in 1961, is a non-party organization which promotes United States commitment and leadership in the world in cooperation with allies and partners in order to indicate solutions to global challenges. Global China Hub deals with issues connected with the ascent of China on the world stage. Considering the little time we have for this hearing, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Arha immediately so he can make his presentation. You have the floor, sir.
Okay, well, good morning, and it's an honor and privilege to be here with you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll just say a few opening remarks and open it up for question and answers. More interested in your thoughts than mine. I'll start with sort of three important points, and I'll speak a little slow for the interpreter to do their job right. First is that I think the 21st century would probably be recognized as the century of the Indo-Pacific region. It is a region that covers the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. It has more than half of the world's population, more than half of the world's global GDP, more than half of the world's trade goes through this particular region. Most of the people who are there are of the younger demographics than other parts of the world, except perhaps Africa. And it's also not only the largest, but some of the fastest growing large economies within the region. So one could make a pretty strong argument that the fulcrum of geopolitics and to some degree geoeconomics has shifted from the transatlantic to the Indo-Pacific. So that's one point. And I think that sort of speaks in ways of perhaps more than 20, 25 European countries have Indo-Pacific strategies. Other than the Indo-Pacific and America and others. And some of them have Indo-Pacific envoys. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that the transatlantic relations in any way are undervalued. In fact, one could argue that they are even more valued for being able to cooperate and do work together as they have done historically in the Indo-Pacific region. And in that particular frame, I think I would point to number 3, which is that the important trends which will, I think, dominate the next 2 decades would be the closer integration of the Indo-Pacific with the Mid-Atlantic region. So I think it's literally talking about how the Indo-Pacific economies and the Mid-Atlantic economies will work together, how the Indo-Pacific Quad and the NATO countries would work together. I think that will turn how the next 2 decades do. In that particular area, I think Italy is probably the most advantageously placed country to be certainly a most important Mediterranean nation engaging with in the Indo-Pacific region, and particularly India, and particularly through the Middle East and the West Asia. To that end, I think the G20 India, Middle East, Europe corridor is a very transformative and important issue. I think the ongoing work between the I2, U2, the India, Israel, UAE, US coalition, I think is an important driver. I can talk a little bit more about it in question answers, that despite the Gaza conflict and despite the recent Israel-Iran trading of missiles, the underlying drivers would force convergence of economies, both of Europe, Middle East, and India together. And I think that's an important area to go. Again, within that framework, Italy should be the leading European gateway to the Indo-Pacific, both as a country and its important ports like Trieste and others. I think there's a lot of room there to work with the G7 presidency to make sure that that Italy in particular cements its role there and its leadership within this factor as we go forward. I'll stop there and take questions and answers in any of the issues I talked about. Back to you. Over.
Grazie mille, grazie davvero.
Thank you very much. In this connection, I'd like to inform you that today we will, here in the Chamber of Deputies, begin the examination of a resolution to appoint a special envoy from Italy in the same way the French did on the IMEC project connecting India, Middle East, and the Mediterranean. And we hope that this will extend to Italy. I'll give the floor to my colleague Billy, who's asked to speak, and I see many colleagues who are remotely connected. If they wish to, they can also intervene. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council Global China Hub for its willingness to exchange views with us. I'd like to ask, with regard to the Indo-Pacific, we, as a country, in Italy, are working a lot and focusing our attention on this area of the world. Thanks to our chair here, Mr. Formentini, we have this committee for the first time in our history, which specifically focuses on the Indo-Pacific inside the Foreign Affairs Committee. Now, with regard to the role our country might have, you yourself said that it may have a guiding role in this, leading role in this area. I'd like to ask you, what do you think of the activity our friends and neighbors, Germany and France, are doing in the Indo-Pacific? And how can we, Europeans, in your opinion and in the opinion of the United States, work together better, for example, Italy, France, and Germany, and also cooperate better with the United States in order, first of all, to keep peace in this part of the world? And obviously I'm referring to issues relating to China, Taiwan, and North Korea, but not just that, and also to promote the prosperity and the economy of this area of the world, since it is very important to keep the peace in this part of the world, but also to promote the economy and the social well-being. Thank you very much. That was my question. Thank you. And I'll give the floor to our colleague Quartapelle, who is speaking remotely. I hadn't I've seen Mr. Bergamini, who had asked the floor before me. Yes, we'll give the floor to Mr. Bergamini then. I hadn't noticed he had asked for the floor before. Mr. Bergamini. Yes, okay. I'll be as quick as I can. I'd like to ask Mr. Arha, and I have two questions. The first one, you said that Italy is an ideal gateway to strengthen these relations between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Could you elaborate on this and specify which factors, apart from its geographical position, cause this status of Italy, what its advantages are? And you spoke of economic areas and key sectors. It's also clear that with the end of globalization, as we've experienced it till now, there is emerging a fiercer competition between states in the economy, with lots of consequential effects. So how can we see, when there is, since there's opposition between countries, how can we see economic cooperation and development in the future? I would also like to thank Mr. Arha. My name is Quartapelle, and we've been focusing on this issue thanks to Mr. Formentini's leadership. It's an issue which Italy has not widely debated. We're really the first to discuss our Indo-Pacific relationships. And what you said was very interesting. I agree with what you said, and you mentioned the possible central role our country can have. My question concerns the relationship between Italy and India. As you know, the relationship was frozen for quite some time because of the issue of the Italian Marines who'd been arrested in India. I think that on both sides now there is a will to relaunch relations. There's also a political situation which is more favorable because of the excellent relations between President Modi and the Italian Prime Minister. If you were in the shoes of Italy, apart from any declarations of principle, what would you give a priority to? Ours is a country which finds it very difficult in general to achieve a more structured position and to go beyond declarations on neighborhoods. There was a selfie taken with President Modi and Prime Minister Meloni. They obviously get on well. They also have close outlook politically and economically. But this doesn't lead to stable and productive relations between the two countries. So could you highlight any opportunities to further the relationship between the two countries? Thank you. I don't see anybody else asking for the floor, so I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Arha to respond to these questions.
Okay, again, thanks again for the questions. I'll take them in order. So first was about the role of France and Germany, then how does Italy function within the global context and economic relationship, and then the Italy-India relationship. So France considers itself an Indo-Pacific country because it holds some territories within that part of the world. And it has taken a very sort of, among all the other European nations, probably the most forward-leaning, other than the United Kingdom, in sort of working within at the security and military level as well. So without going into the detail, it is probably the most forward-leaning of the EU members in that sphere within the Indo-Pacific. So I think, and it also enjoys very strong relationship with India, going back again related to military and other issues, so they see more things eye to eye. Germany, I think, has been a leader in dealing with Indo-Pacific issues from a very long point, both not only with German establishment in Berlin, but also I think a lot of German nationals working within the EU offices has also been a tremendous leaders into the Indo-Pacific part of the world. Now, both of them, there's a kind of an issue as to how do you engage, and I would say you engage in Indo-Pacific three ways. You can engage within economically, which is the most sort of forward-leaning posture within the Europe and goes to European strength, whether it's trade or whatever. There are elements of sort of more sort of security collaboration and cooperation within the region, which happens bilaterally as France and India. It can also happen in a sort of more collective framework. I think it's important to note that NATO countries now, every time there'll be a NATO leaders summit, most of the leading Indo-Pacific nations will be there, like Australia, Japan, South Korea. They show up. India is a little reluctant, but they probably work through an indirect way of greater cooperation. And then obviously there is sort of the people-to-people exchange element of it as well that is very strong, and Europe offers a substantial amount of element there to work on. And I would say that I think France and Germany, and to some degree, I would take it as a European country, not a European Union member. The United Kingdom has certainly been taking the lead, most recently with this AUKUS arrangement, which is the Australia, UK, US on building up of nuclear submarines. So I think that's one side of it. And I'll come back to it in responding where Italy fits in. And that goes to the second question, which was, where is the end of globalization? I wouldn't quite frame it as the end of globalization. I think these terms of end of globalization, de-risking, decoupling, they are slogans. When we look at the trade in the world, it's still around the world. It still has different components all around the stuff. And I don't think we'll go back to ending it. What we'll most probably have is a stratified globalization. So there'll be layers to how the global economy would engage it itself. I would put it in sort of three broad areas. I think in the most critical sectors, whether it be like semiconductors or things of that kind, you would find at the high end of technology a much stronger decoupling among strategic adversaries. And then there'll be a second level, which is where it's not so much critical sectors, but they're important sectors where you cannot possibly allow one country to have a monopoly power over that sector, especially if that country is also prone to using that monopoly power for economic coercion purposes. So that, I think, will run into situations like the electric vehicles, like the solar panels, like other issues related to that kind of stuff. And then you have the third level in which, you know, you're making toys or some other element. And then I think in that case, I think that will be a more integrated global economy. So you're going to run into both a sectoral based stratified global economy. At the same time, you would elevate, I think, more stronger regional arrangements for economic engagement, especially where you put a premium on, so you put a little bit extra cost and premium in other ways of trading with people that are trusted partners than those that are less trusted partners. So I think in this regional framework, so the Indo-Pacific is one regional framework. You hear about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now is the CPTPP, and their RCEP, and there are a bunch of other sort of economic arrangements. For one that we put forward was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So that's one form of sort of regional engagement. The strongest and the most promising regional arrangement, I think, is the India, Middle East, Europe regional arrangement. This is the IMEC corridor. And it's interesting because this area is where the governments are following the businesses. It's not the other way around, that you're sort of forcing the government sort of leading and looking for businesses. I think you already see, and this relates to the Indian part as well, you have an Indian economy that by the end of the decade is supposed to become the third largest economy. You have a country that has already signed a trade agreement with UAE and with other Middle Eastern partners in discussion with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and has just signed a agreement with the European four, the Norway, the Switzerland, the Iceland, the Liechtenstein, and working in then a trade negotiation with the EU and with the UK. So you've got an Indian economy that's engaging more with Europe and with Middle East. You have a Middle Eastern economies which have a tremendous windfall of energy revenue because of Russian sanctions and from European and transatlantic sort of transition away from fossil fuel. So in the meantime, they've become a higher source. And so they have a lot of money and they have a strong need for diversifying their national economies from just a resource-based trading-based economy. So they are engaging with agreements both with you, Italians, the Europeans, the Indians. And then obviously you have a strong need from Europe, which has for a while either America or China being its main sort of trading partner, to diversify that and work with other Indo-Pacific nations, India being one of the main sort of partners there. So this India, Middle East, Europe corridor, it's really, really important element to this. And the question is, when people talk about it, they think about one physical corridor. It's not one physical corridor, it's just that there'll be more trade and economic commerce happening between the port of Mumbai and the port in Dubai and Haifa and Al Said and hopefully Trieste and Piraeus and Marseille. This trading is already increasing and will continue to increase. So the question then is, what can countries and nations sort of help this process further? And so not get too, so one of the important things is, and I was in India earlier this year, there's a lot more excitement towards this from the India and the Middle East, and is from some degree European and American. Was an issue of Gaza and Iran sort of distracted, but the underlying drivers very, very strong. And towards that end is where I see the Italian role a very, very important one, because the Mediterranean Ocean is to the heart of dealing with the Indo-Pacific, and Italy sits at the heart of that. And also Italy has the port that reaches the industrial heartland of Europe better than any other Mediterranean port. I think Trieste for that particular reason. So I think that element brings in pretty closely as an important point in this. The other part, the other sort of issue that is also going on at the moment, is the NATO forward posture in response to Ukraine. At 75, we have 2 new members in NATO, and the NATO forces are much closer to the front lines than they used to be. So that sort of necessitates more important mobilization ability of NATO, not just being on the front lines, but moving up and down the front line in the north-south axis. So between the 3 seas, whether it be, important connection between the Baltic, Black, and the Adriatic. And again, here, I think Trieste can play an important anchor in connecting with Gdansk and Constanza, and not only helping the security element, but the economic sides of the 3 seas. So Italy sits in a very important geographical and I think to some degree diplomatic and political space to being an important fulcrum for Eastern Central Europe coming down to Mediterranean, and then the Mediterranean beachhead working with Middle East and Europe. And obviously this solves and addresses 2 other Italian priorities, whether it be the development of southern Italy and also working with the African nations and providing them either to a Mattei plan or something else, and important economic drivers. So this India, Middle East, Europe corridor is probably the most important economic driver for propelling and sort of boosting African economies, at least on the Indian Ocean side and on the Mediterranean end. So I think that's a kind of a way I would force it. And I think in the G7 presidency, you have a remarkable opportunity to make sure that the G7 is committed to IMEC. It's a G20 initiative, and most of the G7 is there, already signed up to it, except Japan and Canada. The rest of the G7 signed up to the IMEC corridor. That the global the global partnership for infrastructure investment, which is the flagship project of G7, makes this corridor an important element. That furthermore, that the European Global Gateway also makes Italy and this corridor an important element to go forward. And back to the India-Italy part that the colleague mentioned. So I think there needs to be substantial amount of commendations, recognition, both of your ambassador in India, I think Vincenzo Luca, and the office here in Rome, and on the Indian side, to truly move this partnership substantially higher. And certainly Prime Minister Maloney deserves a lot of credit in that. There are economic relationships, there are military relationships, and there are, as I said, people-to-people relationships. So India is going to try to, is the largest sort of purchaser of weapons in anywhere in the world. It is trying to wean itself away from Russians and diversifying its sort of defense system. I think Italy has an important role to play within that. India has an important element of trying to become a manufacturing hub. Again, Germany and Italy have an important role to play within that on the manufacturing side. I think the relationship that was there between Milan and Wuhan on textile and other matters can also be recreated with India in that given instance. So I would also suggest that as we sort of move forward, there ought to be both symbolic and substantive elements of connecting as the two bookends for the IMAC, India and Italy. And that should also represent itself in framing perhaps an India-Italy or India-Italy/European business forum that happens once in Mumbai and once in every other year in Trieste. So it brings the industry and businesses of the two countries come together to figure out how they can import and forward the economic relationships. So there's sort of a lot of stuff that is happening, and I think a committee like yours can play an important role in moving it forward.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for what you said. To conclude, I'd like to put you a very short question. We all know what happened on the 7th of October on some specialized journals. We read that one of the goals of Hamas was to disrupt the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, a normalization which is essential, of course, for a project like IMEC. So in your opinion, moving from Hamas to the axis between Russia, China, and Iran, how are these powers which are trying to establish an alternative world order, how do they see the cotton route opposed to the Silk Road, and what could they do to try and disrupt that?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. So I think, obviously, when Hamas attack happened, there was this speculation that both Iran and to some degree Palestinian Hamas were sort of being left out and wanted to make sure and spoil the party. I think whether that is true, how true it is, that maybe I'll leave it to folks that know better. But I think it's important to see the response to that. And there are two very important responses. One, it is true that the growing relationship, rapprochement of sorts, a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel was certainly slowed by this. I think that's but it has not been derailed. It's certainly been delayed, but not derailed by it. And that's important to note, because even in simple things, certainly the countries showed their sympathy towards Palestinian people. They criticized the terrorist attacks. But as like before, there were no withdrawal of ambassadors. The diplomatic reaction was a normal reaction as opposed to an extraordinary one into working with it. That's, I think, an important element and signal how the region held together. The other important, and the trade relation between UAE and Israel continues. The second point I think is important to know is that how the region came together in protecting Israel and responding to the Iranian missile attacks. So I think that also gives you a very good perspective of how and where the region is vis-a-vis these things, even though there are substantial amount of distraction involved. So those are sort of two important. Third important element is, as soon as IMEC was announced, the first thing that happened, which was that Turkey said, oh, there's not just one, there's another way, and the way from Pacific to Europe is through Iran and Anatolia, Turkey over to Berlin. I take that as a positive signal in which that every country wants to play a role in this converging economies. I think Egypt will have a role through the Suez Canal. I think Turkey may have a role through its actions. And I think both the so-called I2, U2 countries, they would have an important role. And then you respond to the question of Belt and Road. It has to be important that the IMEC has three very fundamental advantages over Belt and Road. First of all, it's a genuinely, a sincerely and transparently multilateral initiative. So G20, 8 countries came together. It's not a bilateral and an uneven asymmetric relationship in one country dominates the issue. No one country dominates IMEC. That's simple. And everybody's working in their own interest. So then people say, if they're working on the interest, who is going to pay the money? Where is the money? Well, all 8 countries can afford to pay for their part of IMEC. They're not dependent on some other country. India can pay its portion, UAE can pay for itself, Saudi Arabia can pay for itself, and the Italian, French, German, EU, and America can pay for itself. So it's not dependent like BRI, that you take money and if it doesn't come in, and then you have the unsustainable debt issues. So that's also an important. So it'll happen in a perhaps not in a completely in line way, but in different segments, working at different times, bilaterally, trilaterally, multilaterally, and it will go forward driven by much stronger economic and political fundamentals. The question is, there is a competition among the European side, whether it's Piraeus, whether it's Trieste, whether it's Marseille and others, so they're all vying for it. I just think, you know, both geographically and sort of politically and every other way, you guys are situated in a pretty advantageous position to take the lead on the effort as the most indispensable Mediterranean nation, not only because of your position in the Mediterranean, but also in your position to be able to anchor the Eastern and Southern Europe on the 3 Cs and other efforts. So I think that's how economically you guys are positioned in a pretty, anyway, favorable way, and it's up to your leadership to take it forward.
La ringrazio ancora davvero.
Thank you truly again, also because of the time difference and the fact you had to get up very early. And I also thank you for stressing that Italy can play a role in an area which may seem remote, like the Indo-Pacific, but which you explained very clearly with the IMEC project might physically be connected from Trieste in a very effective manner. Thank you again.
All right, well, it's a real pleasure and good luck and God bless.
Grazie.